Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to see us here so numerously gathered for this lecture. My name is Catherine Cornell, and in name of my colleagues in the Department of Theology at Boston College, I want to welcome you all to this inaugural Brian O'Brien and Mary Haston lecture in Interreligious Dialogue. This lecture continues a tradition started about 7 years ago of gathering important scholars from different religious traditions to focus on critical issues in interreligious dialogue. Those conferences have led to several publications, among which one on criteria of discernment in interreligious dialogue, a publication on interreligious hermeneutics, on women in interreligious dialogue. And with this lecture series, we continue Boston College's commitment to engaging in and advancing interreligious dialogue through inviting now one major speaker to address an important issue in the dialogue between religions. And this year, we have the extraordinary fortune and pleasure of having His Lordship Rowan Williams with us. Lord Williams is the former Archbishop of Canterbury and currently Master of Magdalen College in Cambridge and Chancellor of the University of South Wales. Rowan Williams was born in 1950 in Swansea, a Welsh-speaking part of England. He studied theology in Cambridge and obtained his doctoral degree in Oxford with a thesis on the thought of the Orthodox theologian Vladimir Lossky. From 1986 to 1992, he was the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity at Oxford University. In 1992, he became Bishop of Monmouth, and in 1999, Archbishop of Wales. In 2002, he became the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury, a position which he held until 2013. During his years as head of the Church of England, Dr. Williams was deeply involved in questions of interreligious dialogue. He has spoken and written widely on the topic of religious tolerance and on the role of religions in civic society. He was instrumental in the development of the Building Bridges seminar, which gathers Muslim and Christian theologians to focus on topics of common interest and to meet each other and learn from each other. This seminar, which started in 2002 and which was chaired for many years by the Archbishop, is considered the foremost expression of Muslim-Christian dialogue in the world today. What is notable about Dr. Williams's writing on the topic of dialogue is his deep respect for the religious other and his love of difference. Dialogue for him is not about discovering similarities or a common core. It is rather about the ability to learn from one another, and in particular from what he calls the other's disbeliefs, the areas in which the other's differences and denials of our own belief challenge, chasten, and purify our faith. To engage with difference is for Rowan Williams not merely a necessity of our times, but part and parcel of the Christian message. It involves moving beyond established boundaries and comfortable places and reaching to the other and to beyond the boundaries that fragment human communities. So interfaith activity is as part and parcel of the church and an expression of Christian faithfulness. In the public sphere, Rowan Williams has been a strong advocate for the rights of religious communities, not only to practice their faith, but also to contribute to the common good. He speaks in this regard of the importance of interactive pluralism, in which different religious communities engage in civic collaboration and engage one another both intellectually and spiritually for the betterment and the enrichment of all. In addition to his works in the area of dialogue, Rowan Williams is also a literary critic and a poet. Among his many publications, I only mention a few of his most recent books. Dostoevsky, Language, Faith and Fiction in 2008. Wrestling with Angels, Conversations in Modern Theology, 2007. Tokens of Trust, An Introduction to Christian Belief, 2007. Faith in the Public Square, 2012. And A Silent Action, Engagements with Thomas Merton, 2013. And just recently, there has been a new edition of his collected poems that came out just a couple of weeks ago. So Rowan Williams is one of the most deeply and genuinely ecumenical theologians of our time. The topic of this evening's lecture is revelation in the context of interfaith dialogue. His Lordship will speak for about 45 minutes, after which we will have 20 minutes for questions and answers. So please join me in welcoming Rowan Williams to the floor.
Thank you very much indeed for your words of welcome, and thank you to all of you for the opportunity to share some thoughts on this occasion. I must apologize for having to be away so promptly after the lecture, but double booking happens to the best of us, and I have to be at an alumni event in Boston this evening, so bear with me. When we think about revelation in the context of interfaith dialogue, an immediate problem seems to present itself. Surely, claims to revelation are claims that here, and here exclusively, is the act of God, and elsewhere, a whole series of human attempts to reach God. Here is God being active, the God of Scripture, the God of the creeds, the God who makes decisions and commits God's self to courses of action in the world. And there is the world of religious striving, for which, if you wanted to be unkind, God sits with his arms crossed, waiting for something to happen. What I want to do in these reflections this evening is to work out with you why that is not a helpful or a truthful paradigm if we look carefully at what we mean both by revelation and by divine action. And there is, of course, one point that might be made right at the start of this reflection about revelation and divine action. The paradox is this: to speak of a God who reveals God is certainly to speak of divine action, to speak of divine freedom. And thus, what God does is both determinate and free. The God who acts out of freedom is also the God who cannot be contained in what God says or delivers. And there's the paradox. If we're serious in talking about divine revelation, we are surely talking about the revelation of what cannot be completely and definitively possessed. The tightrope between those two poles of paradox has been walked with varying degrees of elegance by theologians, philosophers, and contemplatives for quite a few thousand years. But it doesn't do to forget that that tension is built in as soon as we begin to associate revelation with the act of God. There's one other issue by way of preliminary that's perhaps worth underlining. If revelation is bound into ideas of divine action, then it seems we're assuming other religious traditions than our own are bound in to human advance and human achievement, and that can lead us to a very unhelpful polarity, not just between Christian claims to revelation and other faiths, but polarities between the Abrahamic faiths and what are often called the Dharmic faiths, as if Christianity, Judaism, and Islam were preoccupied with divine action, and other faiths, that extraordinarily diverse category which is supposed to include such diverse realities as the religions of the Orient, other religions do not have a concept of divine action that's comparable. They have, at best, a notion of enlightenment or liberation, which has less to do with divine action than anything the Abrahamic faiths talk about. It's a tempting typology. I'm going to suggest that it's a profoundly misleading one. So, let's begin with some thoughts about divine action, particularly in the Abrahamic traditions. All three of the so-called Abrahamic traditions have a great deal in their vocabulary and their register challenging what you might call a mythologized picture of how God acts. The action of God is, in important respects, not like my action or yours. It does not come out of deliberation between a variety of alternatives. It does not have a gap between conception or purpose and fulfillment. It does not have to negotiate with circumstances so that it can be defeated by circumstances. So whatever we say about divine action, we have to be very cautious about the mythology that can surround it, and that does unself-consciously surround it in a great deal of the language we use. This does not make that language false, but it means that we approach it with our critical antennae twitching. Those critical antennae have been sharpened and stimulated by theologians and philosophers in the Abrahamic traditions for a very long time. If we attend to that critical twitching, we may discover that 3 points emerge about divine action in the Abrahamic traditions, which give us a great deal to think about in connection with how we speak of revelation. The first principle about divine action, shared very deeply by Christians, Jews, and Muslims, is that divine act is the eternal enactment of divine being. Divine act is the eternal enactment of divine being. That's to say, divine action is not episodic or arbitrary. Divine action expresses what it is to be God, enacts what it is to be God. In Thomist terms, God's essence, the definition of what it is to be God, is to act in a godly fashion. The second point, which is implied in that, is that divine action is never reactive. It's never simply something which is triggered into being or operation by some other action. We can say, if we like, that means it's free, but that doesn't mean, as already indicated, that it is arbitrary. An eternal enactment of the divine being, therefore never reactive, therefore free. And if an eternal enactment, if never reactive, then thirdly, an act which is always self-consistent. To use the obvious but rather crude image, if the divine action were a great tree growing up through the universe, the rings would be the same wherever you cut them. To put it in more acceptable theological language, the God of scriptural revelation in the Abrahamic traditions is a God who makes and keeps promises, a covenantal God who can be relied upon not to change. And that unchangingness is not a privation of freedom or an arrest of movement, but on the contrary, a way of speaking about the intensity of movement, liberty, continuity that is the acting out of divine being. Those are 3 points about how divine action is classically conceived within the Abrahamic traditions. 3 points which, if we explore them a little bit further, might give us some clues towards thinking afresh about revelation as an expression of divine action. And to take that thinking a little bit further, let me concentrate for the moment on the Christian tradition and the Christian claims about revelation in the reality of Jesus of Nazareth. If what Christians claim is that the life of Jesus, in a comprehensive sense, is the action of God as unmediatedly as it's possible for God to act within the finite world, then what is active in Jesus has the characteristics we've just spelled out about divine action. That divine action in Jesus must manifest what is true of God, not just in first century Palestine or 21st century Boston, but for all ages and all times. It must be true for all. And that, of course, is where the difficulties sometimes come in thinking of the relation between claims made about Jesus and dialogue with other religious families. But we should pause before we assume that the difficulty is quite as knotty as we're inclined to suspect. We should pause and ask, what exactly is it we think is being revealed about God in the life of Jesus? And so here are 2 thoughts about that. I don't have 3 thoughts about everything, I hasten to add. Just 2 thoughts about that. The first is that the God revealed in action in Jesus is a God who does not hold back the divine love in its radical fullness, and a God who does not wait on human achievement before bestowing grace. That seems very clear in the gospel. If we speak of the God of Jesus Christ, that is a God whose action is not conditioned by or conditional upon our good behavior, our achievement, or even, dare I say, our orthodoxy. The act of this God does not wait upon our successful performance of this or that intellectual, moral, or spiritual duty. And the act of that God is one which is unreservedly bestowed prior to, independently of, whatever we may achieve, conceive, or master. And the second point about the God revealed in the life of Jesus, in the most comprehensive sense of that term, is that this is an action which is encountered in and through relations of self-dispossession. This is a God who is met when the ego is set aside. This is a God who, if we have to speak mythologically, sets aside the divine ego or the divine selfhood in isolation in order to be God with us. So, with those basic grammatical points about the act of God, the 3 points about God as active in the Abrahamic traditions, and the 2 rather specific points about the act of God within and through the life of Jesus, we are beginning, I think, to have some notion of what a refreshed and slightly adjusted picture of revelation and divine action might entail. What is made known to us in Jesus is the God who is never reactive, specifically never reactive to our piety, our piling up of obligations laid upon God, but a God whose eternal enactment of the divine being is shown in that radical reaching out to those who have not satisfied divine requirements, but are yet in need of divine absolution and restoration. And so, a God who is active in and encountered in those moments or contexts where the self-protection of the ego is definitively laid aside. A God who appears to us in the selflessness, more specifically the helplessness, even the apparent hopelessness of the event of Calvary. The God revealed in an action which, as we read in Philippians, an action of not clinging. The God whose act is made specific and concrete in the world by a self-giving and a letting go, and a God with whom we therefore align ourselves by our own struggles to get rid of self-protection, of fear and self-serving. Now, to speak in these terms is to say something like this: that the emergence of new meaning in and around the person of Jesus, the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, the emergence of new meaning here is the emergence of a clearer sense of how the divine enacting of the divine being comes through to us. What is revealed is not a set of pieces of information about God. It is something rather more like, should we say, the habits or even the skills needed in human life for the act of God to be transparent to us. The new meanings that emerge have less to do with propositions sent from heaven, that's fairly commonly accepted, more to do with that somewhat elusive, rather hard to pin down sense that this is how we live if this is what we want to see. This is how we live if this is what we want to know more fully. Or to put it in rather plain terms, what's revealed is how to be a disciple. So, to speak of Jesus as the revelation of God, to speak of Jesus as the presence of the act of God in our midst, is to speak at the same time in terms of how we know God in the habits of our lives. We associate with the life and death and resurrection of Jesus a moment in which we've discovered how to live our human life under the judgment and in the light of that picture of a God holding nothing back and a God therefore encountered in self-dispossessing. That's what we know, and that's how we know. And it's from that I want to turn briefly to the question of how that affects interreligious encounter and conversation. If that model of divine action and divine revelation is anything like correct, then when the Christian approaches those who are faithful to another religious tradition, she or he does not come with claims about exclusively vouchsafed information about the divine, but with a narrative and a set of habits, disciplines, or practices in which the Christian says the act of God has become specific. And that means that the Christian will look at those of other religious families with an eye to where radical grace or radical selflessness or covenantal dependability comes to light. The Christian, believing that this is where divine action has come alive, will be listening in the voice and looking in the life of the other for those elements which are in some sense significantly recognizable, not in terms of converging formulae or doctrines, but in terms of habits expressing an openness to causeless grace, habits expressing a dependence on and an orientation to a faithful or a promise-keeping God, and perhaps above all, those habits which educate and sustain the emptying of the ego, the absence of the selfish self, and the presence or coming to birth of radical compassion. Dialogue begins in the moment when the Christian invites the partner in conversation to spell out how things like that, like the habits I've just described, arise from their own basic commitments, their own worlds of thought and imagery. The Christian does not, in dialogue, I think, seek to say, these are the important things about God revealed to us in Jesus. We're looking for signs of them among you, and when we've found those signs, we would like you to sign up. Much more that the Christian approaching the non-Christian says, this is what we have learned about the human setting, the human embedding of divine action. And this, mysteriously but wonderfully, we see in you. We see habits we can recognize. We see melodies whose harmony we can understand and imagine. And we need to know from you how you have learned, where you have grown from in developing and sustaining habits like this. That doesn't, in any sense, I think, compromise or prejudice our proper readiness to say that there is something given in the life of Jesus that affords a definitive and truthful model of how we talk about the act of God. It does, though, express an equally proper reluctance to say that the act of God is exhaustively present in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus in such a way that everything else must be simply the struggles of doomed human beings to get to some sort of divine vantage point. So that revelation and enlightenment may turn out not to be quite so radically opposed after all. Because if I was spelling this out in terms of particular examples, I would note that certainly in most parts of the Buddhist world, enlightenment is very definitely not something you achieve. Enlightenment happens. You receive enlightenment. You are enlightened. The passive voice is crucial for the Buddhist, because this only happens when you've stopped planning. Reading recently a modern Buddhist text, I noted some phraseology which would be deeply shocking to those who think that the ideal is the purpose-driven life, to coin a phrase. The Buddhist teacher in question simply says, planning is what makes enlightenment impossible. Whether that teacher is right or not, the point I'm making is that it won't do to oppose revelation and enlightenment as divine action versus human action. The Buddhist will, of course, have no concept of divine action as we understand it. That doesn't mean that the Buddhist believes that what happens in enlightenment is a human action, a human act among others, an achievement, a skill brought to perfection. On the contrary, it is only when all of those things have been silenced and relativized that you are enlightened. Something occurs, an event in which your perception of yourself, your world, and whatever it is that structures the meaning of that world is turned inside out. Our engagement with other faith families cannot, therefore, I believe, be a zero-sum game. It cannot be the case that to identify divine action in one place means definitively ruling it out in others. And that is, of course, partly because, as I noted at the very beginning of these remarks, the very idea of a God acting in freedom is the idea of a God whose deliverances are not to be possessed, and a God who, if seen acting in this way here, may be expected to be acting in this way elsewhere, and indeed universally. So that to believe that God has revealed God's self in Jesus is to believe that the events and the relationships that the events around Jesus generate have a transforming significance in potential for all language about God, wherever it's uttered, and all behavior oriented towards God or to the holy, and to believe that the meanings generated here, the emergence of meaning that happens around the person of Jesus, is not going to be exhausted or superseded or relativized in the encounter with other faiths. The second point is, I believe, quite significant. Once again, we have to put out of the front of our minds a number of facile misreadings and false alternatives. I said earlier that it won't quite do to say that belief in revelation in Jesus means God is not active elsewhere. Equally, to challenge some forms of Christian exclusivism does not mean that it becomes impossible to say that all human meanings converge, in some sense, on the figure of Jesus. If God is active in Jesus, in the way we believe God is, then, of course, what is going on in Jesus will not be exhausted, superseded, or relativized. Whatever encounters we engage in, wherever we go, whoever we talk to, whoever we listen to. And that's the sense in which I believe it's very important to say that open religious dialogue is a mark not of weakness of faith, but of confidence. The Christian engages into religious dialogue, not because the Christian is uncertain or agnostic about how significant Jesus is and in what mode, but because the Christian is confident that what there is in Jesus will not be exhausted. You will not come to the end of the meanings of Jesus in the most demanding of interreligious contexts. Do we believe that as we embark on interreligious dialogue? I believe that is where we should start, and that is what should deliver us from a neurotic anxiety that hearing what someone else has to say about God and about the holy is somehow going to make us think less of the Jesus in whose spirit we begin and undertake our work. And I dare say the same point could be made in relation to a Muslim or a Buddhist undertaking interreligious dialogue. The ones who do it, to put it bluntly, are the confident ones, and the ones who withdraw from it are the ones who may at some level be not quite sure what they believe. The Muslim embarking on a dialogue with the Christian does so out of confidence that what the Quran declares about God is not going to be exhausted, superseded, or relativized. The Buddhist engaging in that is going to say what is known and apprehended about the practice that makes enlightenment possible is not going to be relativized by the encounter. So, to speak in these terms of divine action, divine revelation, the knowledge of God, is something which requires from us not only a capacity to listen patiently, but to listen, I would say, expectantly. And to paraphrase things I've said at more length elsewhere, I would say that one of the words we need to introduce most regularly and clearly and unashamedly in talking about interfaith dialogue is expectancy. A very odd sort of expectancy. The expectancy of seeing and hearing in the other what I might never have imagined recognizing. The expectation of being surprised, which is, of course, a bit of a paradox in itself. But I do believe that interreligious dialogue, when it's doing its work, is characterized by something of that expectation of being surprised. That willingness to see in the lineaments of another language, another set of narratives, another face, to see what's familiar, but also in that moment to see, as it were, reflexively or recursively, to see something about myself that I had not known and needed to know. Which is one way of saying, of course, that the process of revelation is not simply what is delivered to me in the foundational story of my faith. It's something that continues to happen in the sense that I am revealed to myself in the dialogue that's undertaken, and in that process continue to know more of God. Now this, of course, leaves us in a position of entire confusion and agnosticism about where it's all going to lead. And I don't lose any sleep over that. It seems to me that one of the things revealed, very specifically in the words of Jesus, is something to do with not being anxious about tomorrow. And the person engaging in interreligious dialogue, who is anxious, afraid, uncertain about where it's going to end, is the least likely to grow and develop in the interreligious encounter. And that's a hard lesson to learn, because we would all like to know where this is going. So, do you not want everybody to be Christian? Somebody will ask. And when faced with a question like that, I would confess to total inarticulacy. Do I want every human being to know and love Jesus Christ as the incarnation of the everlasting Word of the one that Jesus called Abba, Father? Yes. Would I like everybody to become members of the church? Well, I'm prepared to spend some time reflecting on what that might mean, and also reflecting on the fact that I don't have any model in my mind which would express what it could mean for all human beings to know and love Jesus as the incarnation of the eternal Word. I don't know that yet, and I need not know that yet. I know that the church in its true form, which is a very question-begging phrase, but bear with me, the church in its true form is the community of those who have been overwhelmed by the gift of God in Jesus Christ, and overwhelmed, therefore, by the gift of God in one another. And the crystallizing of that in the events of baptism and the Eucharist is what the church is fundamentally about. And how is that going to become a reality for those whose apprehension of or perception of Jesus comes from such a different place that I can't begin to understand it? I don't know, and I need not know. What I'm called to do, today, not tomorrow, is first of all, as a Christian believer, to be faithful to what the act of God has done for me and to me in the events of Jesus, to be faithful to revelation in Jesus Christ, the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity. And what I'm also called to do today is to approach those others who claim to be in relation with the unconditional mercy and grace that sustains the universe, to approach them fundamentally saying, what have you to tell me? What have you to give me? And to be ready to be overwhelmed by what they give me, and even sometimes silenced by what they give me. We don't know what mutations of the church might lie ahead. But to borrow a phrase from Joseph O'Leary in his excellent work on religious pluralism, Christianity and religious pluralism, if we don't know what the mutations of the church may be ahead of us, we do as Christians believe that the function of Christ is a constant, that what is perceived and apprehended as the act of God in Jesus Christ remains what it is what it is eternally. To say that lets us step back from any idea that we have mastered, contained, or possessed the revelation received, allows us to say something is happening in the encounter between the family of Christian faith and other families in which, from where we stand, Christ is made known afresh. So that the coming of Christ in flesh becomes not the end and the seal of a process of revelation, let alone a process of discovery, but becomes the opening, the generative moment for an infinite network of relationships whose ramifications we cannot and do not know and need not know. So if the form of religious convergence at some unimaginable moment in the future is inaccessible to us, that ought not to mean that we step back from the encounter of dialogue because we're not sure. Even if we did not engage in interreligious dialogue, the same thing would be true. We do not know what the church will be eschatologically, except that it will be where Christ is all and in all, which is a wonderful and inspiring formulation and not at all practically useful. Except in that ultimate form of practical usefulness, which takes away spiritual anxiety from ourselves. Even if we didn't engage in interfaith dialogue, we would not know the remote future of the church, whatever some might like to believe. And so, the encounter with other faiths is not in that sense different in kind from ordinary, faithful Christian living. Because in ordinary, faithful Christian living, we continue in our dialogue with fellow Christians and with those who do not share faith in our society, we continue to discover how God is active and where God is encountered in unexpected and sometimes shocking places. Once again, if one thing is revealed in Jesus Christ, it's surely that the act of God in shocking places is one of the things you may very well look out for if you're trying to discern where revelation happens. So, to sum up, or attempt to sum up, these still rather unformed thoughts on revelation and interfaith dialogue. My first point is that we need to locate what we're saying about revelation firmly in the context of what we can and cannot say about the act of God, and to understand the act of God in revelation as having to be characterized by some of those aspects I spelled out earlier: eternal, not reactive, consistent, and so forth. I suggested that to apply that specifically in the case of claims of revelation in respect of the identity of Jesus, we needed to think about some of those things that characterized the kind of God who acts in Jesus, the one who does not hold back, the one who does not wait on our achievement, the one who is encountered in self-dispossession. I suggested, thirdly, that means that when we encounter others who want to talk about their engagement with God or the holy, with what holds the universe spiritually in being, we are going to begin by looking for and listening for those things which echo those aspects of the God of Jesus Christ, and to approach other faiths with an eagerness to find out, as you might say, where they have learned that from, and to set that alongside how we have learned it. And that finally that implies that the very act of interreligious dialogue is one of the most potent and unambiguous witnesses we can bear to a faith in the universal significance, indeed the uniqueness of Jesus Christ. A paradox, but not an impossible one. To go out into this bewildering and sometimes disorienting world of interfaith encounter with the stubborn and probably rather unformed conviction that wherever you go, something of Jesus Christ waits for you, is an act of witness. Not perhaps the act of witness some people would like to see, brandishing, as you might say, the memory of Jesus as a weapon to intimidate partners, but an expectant and humble desire to meet in others the God we have met in Jesus, and to meet in others the deep otherness in which they have learned that vision. In short, I believe that a conviction about and commitment to active divine revelation is not the opposite of a willingness to engage in dialogue, but in fact something which sustains a healthy and life-giving practice of encounter between faiths, that encounter in which we continually expect the unexpected, as is only appropriate for our dealings with the God who, whatever God says, cannot be contained in word or thought. Thank you.
Any questions or comments? If you have a question, if you would please raise your hand and you will receive a microphone so that everyone can hear your question.
Hi, my name's Mike Alott. I teach in the philosophy department here at BC. Thank you very much for your talk. Through most of your talk, it seemed like the major thought of Christian encounter with other religions was the idea was recognizing something in the other that Christians had come to know or come to understand. And I was wondering if you thought there was also a moment of learning something that you didn't know, where it wasn't recognizing something that you knew, but acquiring something you didn't have or gaining something. And at the end of your talk, it seemed like you thought maybe that was part of it. And I'm wondering if you could say a little more about that aspect of it. What is it that you see Christians might gain, or what's acquired, or what's understood that wasn't already there in some form or fashion in your way of thinking about it?
Yes. Thank you very much indeed. That's extremely pertinent. I think my reason for talking about recognition initially is, of course, that is one of the things that happens in conversation. We look for the points of recognition. We look for what allows us to see in the other a discourse we can to some extent identify with, because when that's happened, that's when we know where the disagreements arise. Unless we have the moment of recognition, we can't, as it were, make sense of the moment of non-recognition or strangeness or newness. So I make no apology for focusing on recognition as a starting point. I do, in fact, believe that two things then happen. One is the moment of radical non-recognition at times, where you might say to the Muslim or the Jain, I have no idea what you're talking about, which is a very important moment. And the moment where you might say, I do see what you're talking about and I'd never thought of it before. Both of those happen in dialogue. I remember vividly a moment in a Christian-Muslim dialogue where a really quite senior and well-known Muslim scholar leaned across the table to me and said, so what on earth do you mean by salvation? And it was a wonderful moment, actually, because the dialogue was doing its job. That particular person had got to the point of being able to say, I don't know what you mean, and I'm not going to pretend. But equally, on the far side of that conversation, and many similar conversations, it might be possible for that Muslim to say, I never thought of it that way, but yes, I see, as the Christian might say, as I've frequently found myself saying in Christian-Buddhist dialogue, yes, I didn't think of that, but yes. So there is a growing in that. But you're quite right, I think, to challenge an assumption that recognition might be just looking for the same all the time. You look for the same to start with because you wouldn't be able to talk to each other without that. And then be prepared for those two moments, I don't know, and oh yes.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. A comms committee member of mine recently told me I need to think out Revelation a little more clearly, so it was very gracious of you to come all this way to do some tutoring.
My pleasure.
So you spoke about Revelation in terms of habits or skills that are needed to make God's action more transparent. And I was hoping that you could elaborate in a little more detail your own experience or how you have witnessed these kinds of habits that have helped you to think about Revelation in these terms, as well as the relation of doctrine to these kind of habits.
And you're asking about not just within the Christian family, but across the...
Indeed.
Yes. One very important relationship in my life has been with a small community of people who practice meditation together from both Buddhist and Christian backgrounds, whose coordinator is someone who rather unusually has been very extensively trained in both traditions. And I suppose what I've learned from that group and from its convener and teacher in particular could be expressed in two or three things, which, while they have often come through in Buddhist vocabulary, I recognize as echoing some of the things I discover in, let's say, the Eastern Orthodox Philokalia. First is that among those habits which in some sense allow what there is to become transparent is a particular kind of attention to your bodily being. So often sorry, this is a cliche, but probably worth saying, so often we assume that being religious is being awkward and suspicious about our bodies. We are beginning to learn that that's not necessarily the case, and to learn that our openness to what there is can't just be a matter of what goes on inside our heads. So, attention to our finitude, our materiality, our locatedness in a world, that's one thing. With that, of course, comes the attention that issues in silence. Not silence as, so to speak, a mystical ecstasy, but silence as that sheer presence in the moment to what there is, which a good bodily discipline helps you to arrive at. And out of that, of course, the possibility of attention to the there-ness of the other, the sheer there-ness and givenness of the other, the human other and the non-human other, which for the Buddhist is about the arising of compassion in the place of self-preoccupation, which for the Christian is about the recognition of and resonance with the infinitely varied logos of God speaking in every moment and every person. These are the things which, to me, speak of recognizable, not convergence, that's quite the wrong word, but recognizable non-duality. And they don't rule out those moments where a Buddhist, in explaining all this to me, where they're coming from, may come up with a formula about which I say, I've no idea, I'm sorry, I can't see where that's coming from. But it's in that kind of context, and I speak of it because it's in that specific context of a shared practice that I've so often found myself challenged and stretched and baffled, as well as enriched by the encounter. Where do we go now? Let's have somebody, yes, over there.
Thank you very much. And my question has to do in relation with acceptance. What role does acceptance play in this interfaith dialogue in terms of, for instance, acceptance of each other's understanding of divine revelation? So for us Christians, Jesus Christ is the Word made flesh, or the Word incarnate. Yep. But for the Muslim, he's just a mere prophet. Yep. How does acceptance of each other's understanding of revelation play a role in this conversation? Thank you.
Yes, a difficult question, really, and a very practical one in the context of dialogue. There are moments in some Christian-Muslim dialogues I've been involved in where a Muslim will say, but why can't you accept the Quran as the definitive revelation of God? Because all that you want to say about Jesus is there. At which point I have to say, well, actually, no, it isn't, and we can't take a shortcut there. And the reason I can't say that the Quran is the definitive word of God is precisely that it sees a history of revelation after Jesus, which I can't make sense of. But let's see how we've learned this. Let's see how these claims work and what kinds of habit they produce, and the conversation can go on and the enrichment can go on. But for the foreseeable future, the Muslim and I are going to disagree about this. There's no two ways about it. And part of the joy and the challenge of a good dialogue is the capacity to say those things clearly and unambiguously, while retaining the openness, the eagerness that I talked about, to say, well, the way in which you have received what there is of God in the Quran clearly has a transformative effect which speaks to me, which enriches me. I hope the same works the other way around. And I'm always very fascinated by those Muslims, mostly not from mainstream Sunni tradition, who will say at times, there is something about what we want to say about Jesus which is not quite catered for by the plain words of the Quran, although we don't want to be Christians, but we want to explore exactly some of those unexpected depths in the narrative of Jesus which open up for us here. So I think acceptance is an interesting word here, because it certainly doesn't mean a readiness to say, oh, well, yeah, that's fine. That's just what I mean. Let's not bother. Real acceptance, again, I think, is to take the other seriously enough to say, I think you're worth disagreeing with, and I think it's worth pursuing that disagreement for the good of both of us. I'll come back to you in a minute. I'd just like to go over here.
Thank you again. I wonder if the Holy Spirit could be added to your talk. I was
Absolutely.
thinking during your talk of Thomas Aquinas speaking of the whole Christ as the totality of humanity. If the Holy Spirit in the Johannine picture is one who's receiving all and listening to all, then what you're saying in a sense is the Holy Spirit could empower us or inspire us to listen to the whole Christ in all these different manifestations that we have no idea what they have to do directly with Christ, but that's the idea that's there, that they do. That's meant by the universal. So I wondered if that was relevant.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Yes, indeed. And I do hope the Holy Spirit might be added to my talk. God willing. I was deliberately holding back a bit on what you might call the systematic theology, heavy artillery in the talk. But I would certainly want to say in that connection two things. One is what I think is a good Thomist and indeed patristic principle, that to say the Word of God is present in Jesus of Nazareth does not mean to identify the Word of God with Jesus of Nazareth for all eternity. There is that of the Word which is not simply expressed in the incarnate life. The Calvinist principle, the extra Calvinisticum, that there is the inexhaustible Word, if you like. And if we talk about that inexhaustible Word, and we talk about the Holy Spirit as the witness to the inexhaustible Word, then I think we can see that the Spirit is both the witness to the incarnate Christ, the power that makes the Christian say Jesus is Lord and call God Abba Father, and in some sense the Spirit is witness to the inexhaustible Word, enlightening our eyes and our hearts to see with truthfulness and receptivity, if you like, the forms of holiness in other religious families. I promise to go back on that side. Yep, if you'd like to stand up.
Thank you very much. Really liked a fundamental point that you made at the beginning about that revelation in Jesus Christ is the emergence of Christian meaning in a radical setting aside of the ego. Mm-hmm. I often hear that said that clearly, and I find it very compelling to empty ourselves, so to speak, in order to see and become more like God. And yet, but the ego is a tricky thing. And
you've noticed.
And it sneaks back in a lot, even when I'm trying to be a faithful Christian, faithful to as a disciple. And so at one point in your talk, you said, one of the reasons I would dialogue is better yet so that I might discover something more about myself that I didn't know and I needed to know. And I was curious because it seems, wait a minute, are we doing this because, is this all a project of self-improvement? And now we're back in the ego. And so I wondered if you'd comment a little more about why I would want to do this, or what it's definitive about Christian life that would make me want to encounter the other so radically.
Very perceptive point, yes. There's more than one way of coming at self-knowledge, isn't there? There's a self-knowledge which is self-serving. Sadly, I was speaking the other day at the Carmel about what Teresa of Avila has to say about self-knowledge and how some people use self-knowledge as a weapon against others. You know, this is the sort of person I am, don't you dare tell me to do anything else. And there's a self-knowledge which is St. Bernard, St. Teresa, lots of other people, a self-knowledge of humility. This is the kind of being I am. Not the being I would like to be, not a being I'm in control of, whose motivations and perceptions from others I can control. This is what I am. And that, in the right sense, detached sense of who I am and what I am, looking at myself with clarity and calm in the light of the transcendent. That's the self-knowledge, I think, that matters, which is something that takes us below or above the levels of the anxious ego, which wants to get on top of all those things, which wants to reconstruct or maintain a particular model of the self, a particular set of defenses. I think there is a kind of self-knowledge which is about letting go of some of those defenses and letting something grow in that space. But it's a very good point, I think, and one can, sadly, easily, as you imply, turn the quest for self-knowledge into something that is by definition spiritual and wonderful and edifying, whereas sometimes it is just navel-gazing. Face it. Now then, who's next? Somebody here, and then, yep.
Yeah, thank you for coming. This is sort of connected to what you were just saying. And I'd like to hear your comments on the idea related to the religious encounter. And in the religious encounter, in the different religious traditions, there are common elements and wisdom, a deeper wisdom, self-knowledge that comes out of it, that I see runs across many different types of religions. And those people that are aware of it can share that outside of saying, well, I'm a Christian and I believe in Jesus Christ and he is God or whatever. Do you understand what I mean by that? Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if how that has helped, how that can help. It seems like it could. You mentioned Teresa of Avila and the contemplative, the deeper experiences of prayer. Very powerful and can be shared. And it's not to limit the importance of Jesus or Buddha, for it happened centrally with them in the various incarnations. Yep. I just wanted your comment on that.
Thank you. Thank you. It seems to me that part of your question is about how communities, not just specialists or dialogue enthusiasts, grow in a fuller understanding of this. And I think that does have to do exactly with what you describe, which is trying to encourage communities of all religious tradition simply to become more deeply immersed in their own identity. Not as the end of the story, but that's part of it. I suggested that a willingness to engage in dialogue did not suggest a shaky faith in Jesus, but on the contrary, a really quite reckless faith in Jesus. But that reckless faith in Jesus grows only when you're prepared to let your faith be stretched again and again and again by the recognition that Jesus is not just a comfort blanket, that Jesus is not just the image you've created and projected, that Jesus is Jesus, God is God, and you can sit back and let your jaw drop with that. Now, the practices, the habits which help us drop our jaws, which bring us to stillness before a mystery set out in front of us, those are the practices that actually, in effect, draw people closer to each other rather than driving them apart. At least so I hope and pray. Somebody, two people there in the middle. If I can go to you in the yellow pullover first.
I think we have time for more or two more questions.
Okay, two quickies then. Yellow pullover and then the lady in front of you.
It seems to me that in Christian history we have many examples, good and bad, of evangelism, which would be similar in some ways to dialogue, especially to dialogue as you've sketched it, but not identical to it. So my question, at the risk of asking two questions in one, would be, can you
You've done this before.
Comment? Yeah, sorry for being that guy. Can you comment on the relationship between dialogue and evangelism and examples that we've seen of both in Christian history? Yep. Especially if the dialogue you're asking or talking about, if we do see examples of that, then what are they? And if we don't, then how is that in some way a challenge?
Yeah. Thank you. I think you're right. There are examples of evangelism which take for granted something like what I've been talking about. In other words, the effort to step back and say, can I even begin to think how a culture like this might talk about Jesus or listen to Jesus? Can I even begin to think how a culture like this would talk about Jesus or listen to Jesus? The Jesuits in China, but also Vincent Donovan and the Maasai, those examples of mission practice, which are not about coming with a ready-made cultural system as well as a theology, but will ask that question, how might this come alive here? And I'm not in the least disparaging evangelism. I just think that when we talk about that, we need to be very, very clear about what it is and it isn't. It's sharing the good news. It's not a form of ideological bullying, and it's not a form of recruitment. Vincent Donovan, in his Christianity Rediscovered, makes great play of the fact that he tells the story and he sees what people make of it. And if they don't make anything of it, well, it's not the moment. You step back. You don't go away saying, oh, you leave them to see what happens. Lots more I could say, but that's just a quick thought to give time to the last questioner, just in front of you.
Thank you. I had a question about morality, moral theology, and how you see that playing into this dialogue. It seems to me that this can be a real area of tension, certainly among Islam and Western faiths. In your experience, do you see that as a stumbling block? Do you see it as something that can be incorporated into the conversation?
Oh, that's an immensely interesting one. Part of the dialogue that I have been involved in, the Building Bridges sequence of meetings, has in fact come back to issues of, for example, social ethics, the status of women, and so on, to open up in that context, just these questions. So I don't think it's impossible. And I think it's certainly an area where we've got to have the most acute discernment of what's cultural and what's theological, and an acute awareness of internal debates in other religious families. So, to take the obvious example, debates about the status of women in Islam are immensely lively within Islam, and as ferocious as anything between Muslims and other people, sometimes more. And the importance of the dialogue environment here is, I suppose, that, well, it's really back to this question of seeing yourself afresh. A lot of Muslims I know, especially younger professional Muslims, say it's the context of interfaith work and challenge that makes us see we have got to do some real digging in our own tradition to understand why what we say appears so objectionable or difficult, or why it sometimes is objectionable. We've got some critical work to do. And a good dialogue, again, sets up self-critical energy within communities. So I don't think there are off-limit areas. Again, we may not end up agreeing, but we can allow that self-critical work to be taken forward constructively in an environment of trust. And I'm not suggesting
So to close, I want to say a few words of thanks. First of all, to Brian O'Brien and Mary Heston. Brian is here tonight with us. I want to thank them for their generosity in making these lectures possible and for their commitment to advancing interfaith dialogue at Boston College. Thank you so much, Brian. Secondly, I also want to thank the Church in the 21st Century and the School of Theology and Ministry for co-sponsoring this event. The Dean, Mark Massa, is here also present. They helped enormously in advertising this event and helping with logistics, so thank you to them. Thank you all for coming this evening, and most of all, Thank you, Rowan Williams, for this very lucid and profound set of comments that will keep us talking, I'm sure, for a long time. So thank you very much.